Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Facebook Live discussion. My name is Maura Clancy. I'm here at Chisholm and Kilpatrick in Providence, Rhode Island, and I'm joined today by Carrie Baker and Lindy Nash, also of Chisholm and Kilpatrick. Today we are talking about VA math. Before we get into the topics we have prepared for you today, just a few preliminary things. First, we will be taking any questions that anyone wants to ask that you are able to leave in the comments feed next to this video. So we'll do our best to get to some of the questions that you ask, either by providing an answer from the live video today, or at least by posting any materials that we think would be helpful to you. And another thing that you can do to find additional materials on the topics that we discussed today, if for some reason they are not posted, which we'll try to do, is to visit our website at www.cck-law.com. We save a lot of our videos and blog posts there, so definitely check out those materials. So again, today we're talking about VA math. Lindy, why don't you start us off? Can you tell us how VA disability ratings work? So what does it mean to have a rating? What's the effect of it?
Sure. So basically a VA disability rating comes from, so say you're not service connected for anything, you've never filed a claim before. So you file your first claim, say for a knee condition that you think was due to service. Say that knee condition does get service connected, the VA will assign you a disability rating, ranging from 0 to 100 based on how severe your disability is. So that is kind of the gist of it. So every disability, assuming it gets service connected, will get a rating, and that will dictate the amount of monthly compensation that you get. So that is why it's so important. And usually the way it goes is, as I said, you'll file the claim, it'll get granted in what's known as a rating decision, and within that rating decision, that is where the rating will be assigned from the VA.
So ratings are decided by rating decisions, as Lindy said. What factors into the assignment of the rating? What does VA look at in order to determine what rating to give a service-connected disability?
Yeah, so VA will look at, or they're supposed to look at your whole C file. So everything ranging from exams to private treatment notes, in-service treatment records, lay statements, really anything that you've submitted within your time at the VA. That is what they should consider in assigning the disability rating. So it's a lot to look at, but that is what they're supposed to do.
And also, as Lindy mentioned, ratings are important because the rating percentage is associated with a certain monthly payment amount. So that is typically why we usually work very hard in increased rating cases, because there's a compensatory value attached to it.
Right. And so just to add on one more thing, typically, so kind of on the low end, a 10% rating this year is about $140. And then at the higher end, a 100% rating or a total disability rating is a little bit over $3,000. I think it's $3,057 right now. So obviously that's a huge gap, and that is why your rating is really crucial to your monthly compensation.
Great. And Carrie, tell us who it is at the VA that's doing the ratings. Who's assigning the rating percentages for service-connected conditions?
Well, typically it's going to be your regional office rating specialist who sits down to rate the case. That's not in every scenario. If, for example, you receive a rating from the VA and you want to appeal it, you want a higher rating, the board of, if you appeal that up to the Board of Veterans Appeals, they too can assign a different rating than the regional office. But typically it's your rating specialist who's somewhat of a senior VA employee at the regional office.
And they base their ratings, from what I understand, on the VA rating schedule. Is that right?
Correct. They base the ratings on VA's rating schedule, which lists out thousands of disabilities that somebody could be service connected for, and each of those have different rates of severity. So you could have a lumbar spine problem. Could be anywhere from 0% up to the highest it goes is 60%. There could be residuals from that are separate from the low back problem, such as radiculopathy down the extremities, and that could have another rating. So they use the rating schedule to assign the ratings, and the rating schedule itself is based on the average impairment of earning capacity, and that's been that way for decades, and that's the best way the VA has come up with to figure out what disabilities are worth how much compensation, and that's the average earning capacity across the spectrum. And that could be different for different people. A back disability might be a huge, as an example, a back disability might be a huge impact on someone's earning capacity if they're in a manual labor position. It may not be very much reduction of earning capacity if someone's in a very high-skilled, low-impact job. So they use the average of that to try to come up with the ratings.
That makes sense. And it's all based on how severe the condition is at the end of the day.
That's correct.
And the rating schedule also contains different diagnostic codes that are associated with different types of disabilities. So tell us about those diagnostic codes and how those are used in rating conditions.
So the diagnostic codes, if anybody wants to look up VA's schedule for rating disabilities, it's Title 38 in the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 4. And that the whole section, Part 4, is the VA's schedule for rating disabilities. And so you can look up, if you're service connected for something, you can look up and check that to see, well, this is what I'm rated. Are my symptoms compatible with this? And I think I probably got sidetracked from your actual question.
That's okay. So the original question was about diagnostic codes. So usually, and correct me if I'm wrong, but usually if you have a service-connected condition, they will choose a diagnostic code in the rating schedule that best contemplates the symptoms that you have due to your service-connected disability. So tell us about how many, there's a lot of different diagnostic codes and how those are used by the raters when they're issuing rating decisions.
So the diagnostic codes, and I don't know the total number of them, there's a lot. I think of every body system that you have. There's a group of diagnostic codes for that. So there's a group of diagnostic codes for musculoskeletal disabilities, another group of diagnostic codes for neurological disabilities, for pulmonary disabilities, for mental health disabilities. And so each group has multiple diagnostic codes under it. So, for example, there's a diagnostic code for lung cancer. There's only one diagnostic code for that. And if it's active lung cancer, then you're rated at 100%. If it's not active lung cancer, then you're going to go to the residuals. And you could end up getting rated under a different diagnostic code, than the original in that stage. And so it's also important for people to know to look for those diagnostic codes because they may have you rated under something that really, shouldn't, you might be more accurately rated under a different diagnostic code. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that should add, most veterans will not see the diagnostic code that's used because they put those on what's called the code sheet, which is a back page of the rating schedule, and they typically don't send the code sheet out to veteran claimants. They just don't include that as part of the rating decision. We think they should, but they don't.
Right. Yeah, and that can be helpful to know what diagnostic code is being used because, as you hinted at before, VA has a duty to maximize benefits. So if there are two potentially applicable diagnostic codes on the rating schedule that might apply to your condition, they're supposed to use the one that not only best contemplates your symptoms, but also yields the highest amount of compensation.
That's correct.
And in line with that, something you mentioned earlier was residuals. I think you were talking about lung cancer. Sometimes we see that VA bases their rating decisions on residuals of a condition. So for instance, residuals of a TBI. Those are also relevant in assigning ratings. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And Lindy, what happens if you have multiple VA disabilities that all have different ratings? So say, taking Carrie's example, you have a lumbar spine disability that's at a 40% rating. You may also have tinnitus that's at a 10% rating. You might have a psychiatric condition that's at a 30% rating. How does VA come up with your monthly compensation when there are so many different ratings in play?
Right. So that's where VA math comes in. And I can't tell you how many of my clients call and they say, I don't understand. I have a 50% for PTSD and a 50% for sleep apnea. Why don't I have 100%? That's such a frequent thing. This is extremely confusing and complicated. And so that is why we're having this discussion for VA math, because it's not your usual math. 50 plus 50 does not equal 100. So this is where combined ratings comes in. So basically, if you have numerous service-connected disabilities, all with different ratings, they do not combine the way that typical math works. So as I said, 50 plus 50 does not equal 100. It's also really hard to hit 100 on the scheduler rating. So I think that's why some veterans opt for a TDIU if they're unable to work, which is also 100% rating, because it's really difficult to hit 100. Even if you have multiple service-connected conditions, it's really hard to get there. And I think Carrie's going to get into how the math actually works, because it is complicated.
But before Carrie does that, the hardest part for sure of today's
we have
discussion.
diagrams.
But to Lindy's point, if you have multiple different disability ratings, your monthly pay is based on your combined rating.
Yes.
So there can be individual ratings for different conditions, as we were talking about before, a rating for a lumbar condition, a rating for a tinnitus. Your monthly payment will be based on your combined rating, which Carrie is here to tell us about how VA math works. If 50 plus 50 doesn't equal 100, how is VA getting to the combined ratings? How are they figuring that out?
Well, let me first say, it kind of scares me a little bit when she says it's complicated, so Carrie's going to explain it. I grew up, born and raised in Kentucky, so you know how famous we are for our math skills. When I'm asked to explain it to somebody without a diagram, without VA's actual combined rating table, I explain it like this. They look at a person as a whole person. All right, you're 100% whole person. And to Lindy's example, why doesn't 50 and 50 equal 100? So the easiest example I know to give is picture the veteran at 100%. So let's say you gave that veteran a service-connected disability rated at 90%. They subtract the 90% from the 100% of the whole person. That leaves 10% of a whole person left. So you've got a 90% disability rating, and that's what you're compensated at. You've got 10% of a whole person left. So what happens if you give that person another 10% disability for something else that's not related to the 90%? They take that 10% from the 10% of the whole person left. So you've got a 90% disability, 10% of the whole person left, add another 10% disability to that. They take that 10% from the 10% that's left of the whole person. 10% of 10 is only 1. They add that 1 to the 90%. Okay? So now technically your combined rating becomes 91. But they only pay in 10% increments. They round up at 5 and down at 4. So if you have a 91% disability, you're getting compensated at the 90% rate still. So that extra 10% did not change your combined rating. Now look at it with 4 different 10% in addition to the 90. All right, and Lindy said, the higher you go on the rating schedule, the harder it is to get higher. Okay, 4 additional 10% is going to equal, on that type of math, equal 94% combined rating, and that's going to again pay you at the 90% rate. So even though you have a 90% disability rating for one disability and 4 10%, you're still going to get paid at the 90% rate. If you had 5 10%, it bumps it to 95. That rounds up to 100%. Or another way to look at it is you have that single 90% disability rating and you have a separate 50% disability rating. Just like those 5 10s, you're going to take that 50% of the 10% of the whole person left. That's going to give you 5. You take the 5 and you add it to the 90, which is the 90% disability. It gives you a 95% disability rating, which rounds up to 100. So that's the easiest way I can explain it. And if you want, I'll go over the combined ratings table. If you want to do that later,
Well, as you mentioned before, there is a table that's in the Code of Federal Regulations, 38 CFR Part 4. And the table is a way to figure out if you have a certain combined rating and then you have an additional rating added to that, you can utilize the table to figure out where your new combined rating will fall, whether it'll change, and if it does go higher, how much higher is it going? We also have, because this is clearly very complicated stuff. None of us really do this in our head all the time. If we can, then that's great. But we use a disability calculator that we actually have on our website. Again, our website is at www.cck-law.com. We will post a link to the calculator in the comments next to this video, but I use this all the time. I'm not sure about either of you, but
all the time.
Good. The calculator is a way to select all the different.
Carrie doesn't use it.
No.
Carrie doesn't use it.
No.
It's just me.
I use this.
Carrie sticks to the table. But the calculator is great because you'll see that there's all different percentages, and you can check off what percentages apply to you. So if you have a list of disability ratings for individual conditions, you can click on them on the calculator, and once they're all accounted for, we have a function there that allows you to see what the combined rating is. So use the table, do it in your head if you want the challenge, or use the calculator. Either way, this is kind of a complicated concept.
And I think this is a good time, I'll go ahead and explain the table if you'd like. So, like Mara said, the table is in Part 4, same section I cited earlier. To be more specific, it's Title 38 CFR Section 4.25. So if you go to that section in the CFR, you're going to find VA's combined rating table. It looks similar to this, and I don't know if you can see this or not.
Very small numbers.
Yeah, I wouldn't try to,
We might be able to put it up. Yeah, I think the graphics
down one column, it has the various disability ratings. Across the other column, it has disability ratings that you would combine with it. So, for example, if you had multiple disability ratings, this is important. You're going to use the table. And the only reason I don't use a calculator is because I've been using this for so long, it's just easier for me to do it. And I don't do it in my head. No way. So if you had a 20% disability rating, and well, let me say it a different way. Say you had a 50% disability rating, a 30% disability rating, and a 10% disability rating. You want to take those in the highest order down to the lowest. So you start with the 50% disability rating, and you find that on the very left-hand side of the paper. So once you find your 50%, and now you're going to want to combine 30% to that, because you have a 50, a 30, and a 10. You go towards the top column here, the top row has the percentages that you're going to combine to it. So you find your 50 down one side, you find your 30 down the other side. I'm looking at it from behind, and there's your 30, and then you come to where those intersect. And a 50 and a 30, according to the table, I don't have the whole table here. You go across. So you find it, and that's 65. All right, so a 50 and a 30 is going to be a 65% disability. That's going to pay you at the 70% combined rate. But we've got another one. We got that 10% to combine with it too. So once you find the 50 and the 30, which is 65, you go back to the column on the far left, and you go down to 65. And once you find that 65, you want to combine that other 10% to it. You'll go over one row, because that's the row for 10%, and that gives you 69. And 69 still obviously pays at the 70% rate since it rounds up. So that's generally how you use that.
And one more, even more complicated question for you, Carrie, about calculating the combined rating is about the bilateral factor.
Yes.
Can you tell us what the bilateral factor is and how it works?
Okay, so the bilateral factor is the one, if you have a bilateral factor that you're going to use, that's going to be the one time where you're not going to follow what I just said, take your highest rating first, and the next highest, and the next highest, and combine them up. If you have something that's going to be applicable to the bilateral factor, you have to compute that first. All right. So how would that work? A bilateral factor is anytime you have a compensable rating, for example, to bilateral extremities. So if I had both my elbows were in bad shape, and I had a 10% disability rating for each one of them. All right, a 10 and 10 is a 19. Okay, so the first thing you have to do with those two bilateral factors, let me back up. Say I have a 10% for each elbow, and an additional 50% for something unrelated, post-traumatic stress disorder, heart condition, whatever the case may be. That 50% is not part of a bilateral factor. Bilateral factors only include bilateral extremities as an example. And you have to have a compensable rating on each extremity, in other words, 10% or more on each extremity in order for the bilateral factor to apply. So if I had 10 and 10 on each elbow, then that's going to be combined to a 19, all right? You take 10% of that, which is 1.9 in the case of two 10%, and you add it back to that 19. So with and once you add 19 and 1.9, you get 20.9. I'm doing my math right, and that rounds up to 21. So that's your bilateral factor. So instead of having a combined 20%, even though it's technically 19, for say two elbows at 10% each, you really have 21. And that's where you start. On the left column, you take 21, you go down and find 21, and then you combine your other disability that doesn't have anything to do with the bilateral factor, which in that case, in that scenario was a 50%. So you go down to 21, you go across to 50%, that gives you your total rating. So anytime there's a bilateral factor, you always do that first. It's 99.999% of the time it's going to increase your disability rating. It may be the difference between that 54 and 55%. It'd be at 50% or 60% or 90% and 100%. And if you have compensable ratings on, say, all four extremities, then you're going to use all four extremities in the bilateral factor. You're going to do the normal routine and take the highest to lowest of the ones in the bilateral factor, combine them up. Let's say it comes to 44. Just using that as a number. You're going to take 10% of 44. That's 4.4, and add it back to the 44. So your 44 combined rating now becomes 48.4 because it's a 0.4 instead of a 0.5. You ran down, so your combined rating is 48 for your bilateral factor, and then you start applying the ones that don't have the bilateral factor. One important difference there is if you have two extremities that's each compensable, and another, say both elbows are compensable and both knees are service connected, but one knee is 10%, one knee is 0%. You cannot then use the lower extremities, because both extremities, when you're dealing with paired extremities, have to be compensable. If you got a 0%, that does not factor in there. But they don't have to be identical disabilities. You could have a wrist and an elbow on one extremity and just a wrist on the other. As long as they're each 10% or more, all three of them are used for the combined for the bilateral factor. So I hope that makes some bit of sense.
Importantly, the bilateral factor is also on our calculator on our website, just in case that didn't,
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yes.
Thanks, Lindy.
Do use the calculator.
We actually have a question from John. John, thank you for your question. John is asking, if you are rated at a 100% rating, permanent and total, is there a reason to make any further disability claims, and does it make any difference to do that? Any insight from the group here?
I would say it depends. That's a huge it depends. So if you're 100%, and you're thinking of filing a different claim, I always urge people tread with caution there. One, what are you 100% for? And what else can you do, functioning wise, activities of daily living wise? Do you need help with putting your clothes on and feeding yourself and bathing yourself? If you don't, you can do all that stuff fine. A lot of times you might not want to file another claim. So you got to ask yourself, is there a benefit to be had, even a potential benefit for me to be had by me filing another claim? And if the answer is no, just my personal opinion, not legal advice, I would not file another claim. But another thing to think about is, you're 100% permanent total. How long have you been 100% permanent total? If you've been that way for 20 years or more, then you're protected. You're legally protected from a reduction in benefits. So that's another thing to consider. If they can't legally reduce you, then you just have one question to answer, in my mind. That is, will that additional claim get you any additional benefits? If not, personally, I wouldn't do it. If it will, I might do it. But if I was protected, it would make doing it a lot easier, because then there's no chance of a reduction. What you don't want to run into is getting called in for a new exam because you think you're going to get additional benefits when you're already 100%, and it's not going to help you. And you end up getting the one examiner that writes some things in your examination report that looks like you've improved, and now you get a proposed reduction in benefits. So that's rare. And I don't want to scare anybody. That happens all the time, but it does happen. So there's a lot of things to consider when you're answering that question.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Carrie said. Immediately what I thought of, and I think what Carrie was referring to, is SMC, sort of special monthly compensation, which we've talked about previously here at Facebook Live. And so exactly what Carrie said, depending on what you're service connected for, what disabilities give you that 100% rating, and what you're looking to file for, I think it depends. But you're always taking a risk by filing for something new, going in for a new examination. You're never totally sure unless you are protected with the 20-year permanent and total.
And that takes us to one of the other things we had on the list of things to talk about today, which is rating reductions. So, Lindy, can you tell us about increased ratings and rating reduction? So say a person has a disability that's rated at a certain rate. How does it happen that the rating could be increased? What needs to happen for that? And then the other side of it, what happens in a reduction process?
Sure. So you can file for increased rating at really any time. It doesn't matter if you've had one rating for a couple years or 30 years. Say you've had PTSD at 30% for the last 20 years, and now you're feeling like it's really increased in severity and things are starting to change. So you can file that claim for an increased rating and hopefully get a higher rating, which would lead to higher monthly compensation. So that's always an option for you, and you should definitely do that. At the same time, you can have a reduction in your rating, which would potentially lead to a reduction in your combined rating, which would lead to a reduction in your monthly compensation. So that does happen, like Carrie said, not all the time, but it does happen, and it's something to be aware of, especially if you're filing claims, new claims, and have a lot going on. So it's always something to be aware of, and unfortunately a risk that you're taking. And that would affect your monthly compensation and your combined rating if you were to be reduced.
And John, who had asked us the question about permanent and total earlier, that brings up, can you tell the audience what permanent and total is? What does that phrase mean if we haven't already covered that?
Yeah, so permanent and total is kind of what it sounds like. So basically you are 100% rating, you are deemed totally disabled, and if you're found permanent and total, which is not an automatic finding, by the way, but if you are found P&T or permanent and total, it means that the VA has to pretty much leave you alone. So they are not supposed to schedule you for any new examinations. You're not supposed to be, re-looked at, kind of. They're just supposed to let you be and go on your way with your 100% rating.
Unless you invite them to.
Right, exactly.
Which is claim.
Yep, what we were just saying. So yeah, and then usually a way to know if you're permanent and total, a way that I can usually tell is when we get a rating decision. If you see that DEA, so Dependents Educational Assistance, thank you, was awarded, that's usually a sign of permanent and total as well. You can also look on the code sheet if you did receive one. Sometimes it says on the code sheet if you're permanent and total. Those are usually the ways that I can tell. But again, it isn't automatic, and sometimes you have to ask for it.
So I have a question on that. What if you're unemployable?
If you have TDIU?
Right.
Then you have an 100% rating.
Okay.
So if you, as Carrie was getting at, if you have a TDIU or a total disability rating based on individual unemployability, you are paid at the 100% rate. Yes. That is different than a schedular 100% rating that's based on your combined rating, which is the product of all of your individual rating percentages adding up. But it is possible, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, to be permanent and total at the 100% rating when it's based on TDIU or the unemployability benefits.
Right. And the only reason I brought that up is because a lot of people have some confusion there. They think you have to be a scheduler 100%, be permanent total. You could have a 70% rating and be getting 100% based on unemployability and it be permanent. Because you're getting 100%, it's total. Because you're permanent, it's permanent. So you get permanent total status through TDIU as well.
Right. So it's basically VA kind of acknowledging that it's unlikely that your condition is going to improve. So therefore, they're going to assign you that P&T rating or give it to you.
And so clearly VA is sometimes in tune to improvements in your condition. If you're going to exams and the exams are showing a varying degree of severity of your condition, they might change their ratings based on that. And that kind of feeds into the concept of stage ratings. Lindy, tell us about when stage ratings come up in some cases.
Yeah, so stage ratings usually occur when the VA is looking, through the C file, looking over the evidence of record, and they see a really clear, delineation of during this period of time from 2015 to 2018, your PTSD symptoms warranted a 30% rating. But then all of a sudden, those next 2 years, your severity really increased, and so they're going to award you a 50% rating. So therefore, it's not really a reduction, it's just a stage rating. So you have 30% for this period of time and 50% for this period of time. And again, that would change your combined rating and change your monthly compensation.
And another thing that can also change your compensation is if VA assigns you an extraschedular rating. So we've talked about the rating schedule, which is based on the average impairment in earning capacity. We've talked about the different percentages that you can get pursuant to the rating schedule and the diagnostic codes in the rating schedule. But given VA's recognition that not all of the diagnostic codes or not all of the things that are listed in the rating schedule are going to best fit your circumstances, they leave open the possibility for compensation based on an extraschedular rating. Tell us about just a little bit of basics on that idea.
Yeah, we could definitely talk about extraschedular ratings for a while, but you totally hit the nail on the head. The basis is that an extraschedular rating can be awarded if your symptoms fall outside the schedular rating. So if you think your symptoms are not adequately contemplated by the rating criteria, then you can apply for an extraschedular rating. So kind of an example that I think of all the time is, say that you have a 40% rating for a back disability, lumbar spine. So typically, the diagnostic code for the lumbar spine is based on limitation of motion, range of motion. It's a pretty rigid schedule. However, say your back disability also causes depression and sleep impairment. So obviously your 40% rating for your back isn't adequately compensating those extra symptoms that you're getting. Therefore, you could apply for an extraschedular rating. They are kind of rare, honestly. I don't see them granted too often, which is why they aren't super popular, but it is a special, unique circumstance that you can seek.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And analogous ratings, Kerry. What does it mean when VA starts rating conditions by analogy?
So analogous ratings are when you are service-connected for a disability where there is no diagnostic code for that specific disability. So you heard us talk about diagnostic codes earlier. If one does not exist for your disability, they will choose something by analogy. So in other words, a code of a disability that best fits your disability, and they'll code it in a special way that if you're looking on the code sheet, if you happen to have a copy of it, it'll be a hyphenated code a certain way, and that's kind of your indication that it's been rated by analogy. They're not supposed to do that if there's a kind of specific diagnostic code that mandates that they follow that diagnostic code for a disability. But there can be some circumstances where there could be more than one analogous rating. So maybe this diagnostic code and these other two basically are similar to your disability. So which one do you use? Which code do you use to rate the disability that's not listed in the rating schedule, which is the one you're service connected for? They're supposed to pick the ones that compensate you the most, that still account for your level of functioning. So that's always something that you just have to look out for. Are they using the analogous ratings correctly to maximize your benefits, or are they doing it to minimize your benefits?
And I think Kerry makes a great point. A lot of the concepts that we've talked about today, extraschedular ratings, increased rating, stage ratings especially, all of that derives, I think, from VA's mission or their mandate to make sure that they are capturing the maximum impairment and paying you for it. If there's a time period, even a short time period within an appellate period where your rating should be higher, then they are required to give you that higher rating whenever it's warranted. The same thing goes for extraschedular ratings, just to make sure that all of your impairments are being captured by compensation. So one of the things that we get asked sometimes that I thought we could just touch on briefly today, although I know that we do have other videos and blog posts on it, is how VA goes about rating conditions that are service connected based on aggravation. So I know that there's some math involved in terms of having to figure out what the baseline was of the condition before it was aggravated. Kerry, can you talk about how they calculate those ratings?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of difference if you're referring to a disability that pre-existed service that was aggravated by the military service, or a disability that's a non-service connected disability that you acquired after service that's aggravated by another service connected disability. They're both aggravation. They both generally work the same way. I won't get into nuances between the two. There's litigation on some of it. But generally, let's say let's pick, what you see the most is aggravation of a non-service connected condition by a service connected condition. We use two knees. All right, for example, so you had one knee, you got shot through the knee, and it's progressed to the point where you had a total knee replacement, and that knee is service connected, but you had, say, a non-service connected arthritic condition in the other knee, and you applied for service connection based on aggravation of your opposite knee. If they can determine the baseline prior to the service-connected disability aggravating it, then they'll deduct that level from the rating, the total rating. So let's say they look at your arthritic knee, and it's a judgment call in lots of situations here. They think, all right, before the service-connected knee replacement aggravated the other leg, it was worth 10%, but now it's progressed to the point where it's worth 30%. You would get a 20% rating for that other knee. Mm-hmm. If they cannot discern the degree of aggravation, they are not supposed to deduct anything. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a little difference there when you're talking about the two types of aggravation, which we can get into later.
Okay. Good to know, though, that there is additional math involved in those.
There's more math, yes.
And so finally, I wanted to get some advice from both of you about what you should do if you disagree with the rating that's assigned. Maybe you disagree with the initial rating that's assigned after you're granted service connection. Maybe you disagree with the decision that you haven't shown that you deserve an increased rating, or maybe you are disagreeing with a rating reduction. What should you do if you want to change the rating that you have for a disability? Either of you.
Well, I'll go first just because I'm closer. First, you got to ask yourself a good question. Do you have a representative? Are you on your own? Do you know what you're rated for? Why you're rated that? So it's best, in my opinion, to educate yourself. Go to find out what diagnostic code you're rated under. Get a copy of your claims file. If you ask for that, it'll include the code sheets that you might not otherwise have. Look at your rating. Look at the schedule for rating disabilities to see what diagnostic code they have, and look at what your symptoms are. Mm-hmm. Are they accurately compensating you? If you feel they're not, I would file an appeal against that. Mm-hmm. And I know Lindy will probably talk about appeals, so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, appeal that thing. It is not uncommon for the VA to assign an improper rating. So if you, like Carrie said, you're the one who knows your symptoms the best. So if you feel like your rating does not adequately compensate your symptoms, then appeal. Be really cognizant of the deadlines. There are deadlines for filing appeals. So make sure you're within the deadline. Gather whatever evidence you can, whether that's treatment notes or lay statements or opinions, whatever you have, and file that appeal. And definitely this can be really complicated. So if you'd like to seek representation from your local or locally from your VSO, our colleagues at the DAV, anything along those lines, I definitely encourage you to do that.
Great. Any other questions?
Use the online calculator.
Yeah, use the online calculator.
I'd like to add one more thing to the answer we gave to John. And I apologize. I think there's something I may not have covered. And I want to add this because I've seen this in lots and lots of cases. Let me take John's scenario, which is 100% permanent total, and add some more examples of that. So let's say, for example, that was based on, I'll just use a Vietnam vet exposed to Agent Orange who developed lung cancer. That's all a presumptive disability. And so let's say a veteran developed lung cancer. He was rated 100% while the cancer was active, all right, which is what they're supposed to do. They got it under remission. They reduced it down to 10%, whatever the case may be, and say it comes back. All right, it comes back a year later, 2 years later, and the VA is supposed to rate it at 100% again because it's active. So say this time it doesn't look like it's going to be brought under control, and they make that 100% permanent total. All right, they usually won't do that on the first time out unless you're already terminally ill because of the cancer. And I'm just using cancer as an example because it's easy. So let's say when it comes back, you get that 100% reinstated, and other than that, you're okay. Okay, not that lung cancer is okay, but you're up and around, you can feed yourself, you can take care of yourself. But a little while later, say that cancer moves to your spine. From the lung cancer, from the original service-connected cancer, now you can't walk, right? And you know you're not getting better, right? At that point, even though you might not be protected, there's a very, 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 very slim chance you're going to get reduced. And if you do, you should appeal that decision. There, I would file for an increase. I would file for the increase based on the cancer of the spine, if that was where it spread to. If you can't walk because of it, there's additional. So there are times in very severe scenarios that I've seen people at 100% that could have gotten high into the special monthly compensation levels, which we have a video on, so we don't need to go into that. They could have gotten a lot more compensation. But those are very, very severe cases, so just take that with a grain of salt. There are scenarios where you want to do that.
Great. Thank you both so much for all of this information, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope this was helpful to you. Again, check back through the comments next to the video for any additional information that might be helpful to you, and please visit our website for other blog posts and videos at www.cck-law.com, and thanks again for joining us today.